There she is. Welcome all to Conversations in American Culture, which is a partnership between the Seminary Co-op Bookstore and the Karla Scherer Center for the Study of American Culture at the University of Chicago. I'm Eric Slauter. I'm the faculty director of the Karla Scherer Center, and it's my great pleasure to welcome our guest today, Autumn Womack, whose book, The Matter of Black Living, The Aesthetics of Racial Data, 1880 to 1930, has just been published. I'm holding an actual copy of it in my hands by the University of Chicago Press. Before I introduce Professor Womack, I want to make sure that you all know that the Scherer Center is offering a special 15% discount plus free shipping on all orders of The Matter of Black Living placed through the Seminary Co-op through May 19th. To access that discount, please use the coupon code WOMACK, W-O-M-A-C-K, at the Seminary Co-op's website, which is www.semcoop.com. This series is designed to explore the topics of exciting new books, as well as to consider some of the methods used and the choices made by their authors. You'll have a chance to join the conversation by using the Q&A function through Zoom, which I will try to moderate. Please enter questions as they occur to you, and I will do my best to convey them to our guest, either as they come in or toward the close of the discussion. Professor Womack earned a BA at George Washington University, where she studied with Jennifer James. She then earned a PhD in English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University, where she worked with Brent Hayes Edwards, who has been a guest of the Scherer Center, Saidiya Hartman, and Elizabeth McHenry of NYU, to produce a dissertation entitled Social Document Fictions, Race, Visual Culture, and Science in African-American Literary Culture, 1850 to 1930. Don't wince, Autumn. Since completing her dissertation, she has held a postdoctoral fellowship in the Department of English at Rutgers, where she found an additional mentor in the late Cheryl Wall. She has subsequently held a faculty fellowship at Penn State, where she was affiliated with the Center for the History of Information, and she held a faculty position at the University of Pittsburgh. The author of articles in American Literary History, Black Camera, J19, Women and Performance, the Paris Review of Books, and the Times Literary Supplement, Professor Womack is currently an assistant professor of African American Studies and English at Princeton University, where she teaches a course on Toni Morrison and the ethics of reading that makes extensive use of the 200+ feet of archival materials in the Toni Morrison papers that are now at the Princeton Library's special collections. She has agreed to open our conversation, which I hope will touch on the web of associations, affiliations, and archival investments that I've just named, by reading from the opening pages of her new book. Welcome, Professor Womack.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'm sorry if there's a little bit of background noise. It's a busy rush hour on my block and it's warm, so the windows are open. But really, thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for being here. It's really a treat to talk about the book. It's been out in the world for about a month, so it's just been fun thinking with people and being in conversation with it. And yes, I was wincing the whole way with that dissertation title, like yikes. But here it is. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the earliest pages of the book. Let me turn up my volume, which gives a little bit of the historical contextualization, and it outlines some of the key questions and themes and really conceptual junctures that I'm thinking through in the book. So, The Quest of the Silver Fleece, W.E.B. Du Bois's first published novel, stages a racial data crisis. An account of the intersecting worlds of cotton speculation, liberal reform, and post-Reconstruction politics. Quest's fictional territory is populated by a motley crew of reformers, students, farmers, and financiers, all of whom are variously invested in Toombs County, Alabama, a fictionalization of Lowndes County, where Du Bois coordinated research for his lost social study, Negro Labor in Lowndes County, Alabama. In Toombs, Du Bois introduces Bless Alwyn, an enterprising boy who arrives to attend the local all-Black school, and Zora, a quote, heathen hoyden of 12 untrained years, who is as captivating as she is categorically confounding. Quest's data dilemma, as I call it, comes into focus against the background of the late 19th century's racial, technological, and disciplinary particularities, all of which were crucially concerned with the matter of free Black life. As the century came to a close and the political and social aftershocks of Reconstruction's failures intensified, questions swirled around African Americans' relationship to the nation. Rechristened the Negro problem and outsourced to a burgeoning class of social scientists, race theorists, and reformers, Black freedom was formulated as a perplexing problem best addressed through data-driven analysis and empirically grounded research. As they endeavor to order the seeming disorder of free Black life and mitigate the deep anxiety about incorporating African Americans into the national landscape, race theorists harness sociological studies, statistics, photographs, and literary texts as novel data sources. What ensued was nothing short of a data revolution, one that authorized the visual and racial schemas that determined whose life mattered, regulated a color line that emancipation threatened to destabilize, and streamlined the technologies that converted Black people into statistical integers, mere data, and the subject of a national racial problem. Certainly, the violent processes that sought to order, control, and systematically quantify Black life are not particular to the turn of the 20th century. The revolutionary nature of racial data at this moment, then, is owing to the particular ways that innovations in data technologies met the specificity of the post-emancipation landscape to produce a frenetic outpouring of racial data in the name of addressing and resolving the Negro problem. Against the compulsion to isolate, atomize, and apportion Black life as an object of knowledge and a problem that could be measured, classified, and contained, in Quest, Zora emerges as an inscrutable force who defies the moment's taxonomic compulsions and evades even the best attempts at social ordering. A swamp-dwelling girl who earns her living in a brothel and rejects the purported value of both formal education and narrowly defined domestic duties. Zora is stationed outside of normative social and gender categories, rejecting the social legitimacy and sociological legibility that her status as either a student or a participant in a capitalist economy would afford. Simultaneously poised as the ideal candidate for social reform and exploding the social containers that seek to define her, Zora materializes at the intersection of Du Bois's commitment to an empirically driven approach to the Negro problem, what he summed up in 1898 with the mantra, if we would solve this problem, we must study it, and the realization that when it came to studying social life, quote, facts were elusive things that could not be easily converted into actionable information. In the pages of Quest, Zora is ultimately transformed into a bourgeois subject who renounces her morally questionable, if economically independent life, first as a pupil in the Negro school and ultimately as Bless's partner in life and business. Nevertheless, the slippage between Zora's incalculability and her susceptibility for reform deserves pause. For even as Quest manifests the Victorian-inspired reformist vision that Du Bois was never quite able to shake, it also articulates a productive oscillation between data's instrumental horizons and the elusive nature of free Black life. This interplay is at the heart of the matter of Black living's exploration into the aesthetic offspring that are produced when Black social life confronts data's disciplinary regimes. Mounted on stages and in photographs and surfacing in technical missteps and strategic narrative decisions, the dissonant interface between Blackness and data is animated by the project of squaring the vitality of Black life with data. This data crisis, as it were, finds expression in aesthetic innovation at the historical juncture when racial data was as much an experiment as was Black freedom.
Thank you so much. That's really wonderful, and I think gives us a great point from which to step off. One thing you didn't mention was that the book starts with 3 epigraphs just above the
I know, I always forget that
is sort of the meta text, and the first one is from W.E.B. Du Bois, who's the subject of the first few paragraphs. So the book begins with an epigraph from Du Bois, really wonderful. It's drat statistics, these are folks, which is a reference. And then you mention a lost social study by Du Bois. You gesture to the data revolution that Du Bois both participated in, and also came to resist in crucial ways. I think he was conflicted, you show throughout the book and in the passage you just read. You also close the introduction by telling us that the figure of Du Bois haunts every chapter. Haunts is your word. And then finally, you mentioned in the acknowledgements that that it was in Saidiya Hartman's graduate seminar on Du Bois and his circle that that your ideas about social science and literary practice began to cohere. So I wonder if we can start where you start with Du Bois, and if you can maybe talk a little bit about the role his thinking plays for you and the kind of protagonist he is in this book.
Yeah, it's funny because when I wrote that line in the introduction, and introductions are, for me, it was one of the very last things that I wrote. So I actually was haunted by him at that point. So I felt like I couldn't shake him, and he was somebody that I had to keep coming back to. So one of the ways that I started thinking about what ultimately became the book was precisely through what I started noticing as a graduate student as Du Bois's kind of uneven, ambivalent, kind of recursive relationship to social scientific forms. So we have that moment in his autobiography, I believe it's in Dusk of Dawn. He talks about it in both of his later autobiographies, where he says, he accounts for himself as somebody who is deeply invested in continental sociology, Western philosophical traditions, and a particular kind of empirically based research that is, most fully articulated in something like perhaps the Philadelphia Negro. And he tells the story in that autobiography of, I was doing this kind of work, and then I encountered Sam Hose's lynching, and I realized that the work of the kind that I was doing wasn't working, essentially, right? And he says, then I started doing a different kind of work. And as we tell it in literary studies and Black studies, that is what kind of launched the thinking and the different kind of work in Souls of Black Folk. And still, right, he always was still preoccupied with sociology, right? He was still running the Atlanta University labs, sociology labs. He would then try to reactivate those sociology labs in the 1920s with the Philon Institute. He never really stopped thinking or investing in a certain kind of empiricism and sociology. So I was kind of interested in that recurrence, right? That picking up and putting down of, these methods that he realized were quite violent, but also were doing something generative. And so it was that relationship between kind of the knowledge of the violence of these kind of empirical forms and sociological methods, and also the investment in them, and the investment really in the idea at this time period for African-American cultural producers and intellectuals in particular, that producing a different kind of knowledge and information and data could do some political good, right? So it was that kind of, that double step that I was really interested in exploring, and that Du Bois really does help me track, right? If one of the things that I'm trying to think through in the book is this kind of picking up and putting down and experimenting with these kinds of data forms or expressions of data, then Du Bois becomes a useful kind of character, right? Who I can move with, and who was also in conversation with other people who were up to a similar kind of project.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the Bob Gooding Williams book on, in the shadow of Du Bois, and you talk about in this passage that you've just read about the sort of aesthetic offspring of the kind of the clash between racial theory and social science that's producing it. And one of those producers is Du Bois himself, who's producing fiction, as you're talking about. And you wrote a dissertation at Columbia, the one I just mention it, and I should say I mention everybody's dissertation. It's not, but it struck me that in looking at yours, you were interested there in social document fiction, which is another term that appears in the introduction and in the book, and especially in the first chapter. It was Locke's term or phrase for Du Bois, and I don't think it was I think it was a critical term for what Du Bois was trying to do. So you were looking there at cases between the 1850s and the 1920s and 30s. What did Locke mean by social document fiction, and how did you come to be interested in that genre? It really is a genre.
Yeah. So Locke used that phrase kind of offhanded in a 1928 article. I think it was called like the evolution of Negro literature or something, Negro's contribution to a literature, that's what it was. And it was in one of these kind of like survey issues of Black life in the Annals of American Academy of Social Science. And it was on kind of an update, let's take the pulse on the Negro problem, right? And so he did this contribution on literature, and he gives this really, it's not surprising, but he gives this genealogy of Black literature. And for him, you know, he's quite troubled with what he takes to be kind of a disruption or a rupture in what could have been a smooth ascent from kind of politics to aesthetics. And he sees this moment in the 1880s and 1890s with Paul Dunbar, and he's like, you know, we were on the way to doing kind of art for art's sake, he calls it, like he uses that phrase, and kind of really leaning into the aesthetic, right? And then he says Du Bois disrupts that with his investment in politics and propaganda. And he produces, what really threw it off track was Quest of the Silver Fleece, which he describes as a book that was, he said, social document fiction. It was more interested in politics, propaganda, and really kind of a sociological study of, in this case, the Black Belt and cotton production and kind of capitalism at that time period. And so what was really interesting to me is I was like, okay. And then he says, you know, after that, we got back on track, and then people began to be more excited about art for art's sake. And we had kind of anthologies and Brathwaite and all of these things. So when I was reading this as a grad student, I was like, you know, what's really interesting is that I always thought of Quest of the Silver Fleece, if not a text that's particularly, you know, aesthetically astute, right? But that is doing some kind of like interesting work, like kind of some formal experimentation. It's sitting at the nexus of kind of melodrama and fiction and sociology. Du Bois called it economic study. And so I wanted to think if there was something that could be at work besides just kind of a pejorative off step or kind of getting off the track of a Black literary genealogy. And it occurred to me that lots of writers during this time period were doing what Du Bois was doing in Quest of the Silver Fleece, which is kind of doing this generic mashup that produced what often kind of veers into the speculative, right? There's like magic cotton seeds and all this kind of thing in Quest. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about Sutton Griggs's Imperium and Imperio, which kind of also is kind of the didactic, the melodramatic, the sociological. And so I wanted to think of a way to make sense of this body of literature whose writers and authors thought the work was doing something else, if not necessarily producing an aesthetic project or contribution to Black literature, but doing something else. And that something else, I think, was sociology. So I was, in the dissertation, really invested in answering the question, what does it mean to think about this body of fiction that's so weird, as actually doubling as some methodology of sociology. So that's what I was like trying to wrap my head around there.
Was the Sutton Griggs novel, which is one of the center pieces of the first chapter, was that the first germ of the project, or did that come later? What would you know, if you were to be your own archaeologist, what would be the earliest of the book? Yeah. What sort of remains in the book as the earliest?
Yeah, I think it's Sutton Griggs, oddly enough. So Sutton Griggs is a holdover from the dissertation. I chopped the first chapter that was in the 1850s. So Sutton Griggs is, I was really trying to make sense of this novel. And of course, it's been kind of nearly canonized now. But kind of the social document fiction gave me a way to think of it outside of some of the terms and genealogies that it had been thought of in Black literary history and studies, which is in terms of kind of the novelization of African-American literature or the emergence of Black speculative fiction or something like that. And it seemed to me there was something else going on, particularly because in his autobiographical pamphlet, Sutton Griggs, who went on to write 5 novels and kind of had a publishing company, and he was really active in Black literary culture. So when he's kind of giving an account of the publication of Imperium and Imperio, he tells the story of how he solicited reviews from some of what he calls the best minds. And one of them was Kelly Miller, who was a mathematician and dean of Howard University, and kind of in the circle of Du Bois and folks. And as he tells it, Kelly Miller reviewed the book, and in terms that are almost identical to terms that Kelly Miller used to publicly review Frederick Hoffman's statistical study, which I talk about quite a bit in chapter 1. This is all to say, I was like, there's a way that Sutton Griggs is embracing the reading of his book as a book that is in conversation with statistical and sociological texts, which is not a way that we would ever read in any kind of thorough way, I think, Imperium and Imperio. So Imperium and Imperio became kind of this incubator for the texts and archives that I then began to mine. It also then makes an appearance or led me to an archive that I talk about in chapter 2 and really was the centerpiece of a lot of the thinking.
Yeah. So one of the things that happened in transforming this into the book that I can hold in my hands was that you abbreviated the timeline. You dropped from it was a project that traced a very long genealogy from the 1850s through the 1920s and 30s. And the bracket here is shorter, 1880 to 1930. Can you talk about this as a period, as a way of sort of segmenting this particular phenomenon,
Yeah. So one of the ways, so the 1850s just fell out, like it was doing something different. It took on a life of its own, or never was reanimated. But so the 1880s to 1930s. So what I'm really thinking about there, or really trying to invite us to think about, is kind of a infrastructure for thinking about the emergence of African-American and Black aesthetic practice that is oriented alongside of what we think of now as the emergence of disciplinary formation, right? And so often when we talk about the rise of the disciplines, whether it's kind of sociology or anthropology or English, kind of they emerge in the 1880s and 1890s and then get codified and institutionalized as we know them now in the 1930s. And so that in-between period was really exciting to me because it offered this fertile ground for experimentation in ways that I think felt quite meaningful for the people who were making the intervention sociologically or anthropologically, in the case of Hurston, who I look at in the 3rd chapter. And I think one of the other arguments that emerges as I'm charting this other kind of periodization, I'm not sure if I totally want to use that word, is that we get to think about this other kind of backbeat of the emergence of African-American literature in a period that often kind of trips folks up, I think. So we often think of it as like postbellum, pre-Harlem, and that's been a useful framework for scholars in American and African-American literature. But it doesn't fully account for kind of the historical and disciplinary kind of interventions and intersections that I think were happening there, or were at work in the emergence of this body of literature. I think the other thing that happens is that it's just a tricky time period for scholars to write about. So when I was trying to I was trying to think about people who I wanted to be in conversation with or read the book for at various stages, manuscript reviews or whatever. It's like, everybody at some point in my field has written about the 1880s or 90s or their first books are about it, but most people kind of move beyond it. It's not somewhere that people kind of dwell in. So I also really wanted to kind of really think about what a model or framework would be that allowed folks to kind of really sink their teeth into it, if that makes sense.
That's great. And the other thing that seems to me, having only just looked at the dissertation abstract and so forth, is that you abbreviated the chronology, but then you also sort of expanded the kinds of things you're looking at. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that process, the entry of maybe photography and film alongside fiction?
Yeah. So when I was originally thinking about this as a dissertation, I really was thinking just in terms of science, right? Like I'd started with Martin Delaney and was really interested in his life as both scientist and fiction writer. But when I really started like honing in on this time period, which was also, really the period that's animated by this question about how we are going to solve, right, in kind of the empirical way, but also kind of conceptually and nationally, the problem of free Black life. Thinking about the sites and spaces where that problem gets articulated and ultimately attempted to be solved, it really, I wanted to think a little bit more sustained about kind of what those sites might be, right? Where the Negro problem gets answered and where the Negro problem gets articulated. And in that way, I really, if I could tweak the book a bit, I would think more about or I would make clearer that one of the things I'm really interested in are kind of data as expressive forms, like the mediums and the modalities that make data legible to us or make bodies legible as data. And so the social survey was always something that had been on my mind because of Du Bois, of course, but also because of the ways that I tracked a number of Black intellectuals who always had some kind of investment or relationship to the social survey. So I really spent time kind of fleshing out the way that various people kind of flirted with, grazed up against, tried, saw some kind of, there was an aspirational desire for the social survey to be the kind of form that might produce a different kind of social knowledge about Black life. And that desire, that aspiration was always a body of knowledge that was vital and enlivened and kind of had a life pulse, hadn't been flattened. And then photography also seemed to me a really important medium through which Black life was made meaningful and legible, but also was a really important data source. In the second chapter, I talk about photography and lynching, and there's no shortage of scholarship on lynching photography. But one of the things I think that endures across all of the scholarship is that lynching photography doubled as a data source, even for somebody like Ida B. Wells, right? It's producing a certain kind of information about lynching and about, in the case of pro-lynching photography, the value of Black life. And then film was always in there. And this kind of was a part of my interest in science and kind of African Americans who were also working as in the realm of social science and science. So Hurston became the figure there, and film also. I wanted to think about, from early motion picture to kind of early documentary photography that Hurston's a part of, kind of how that also was tried to be, mobilized as a certain kind of data source.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So this is as you just said, a 3-chapter book, but the chapters themselves they're long. Well, they're long. They give the topics, they give the protagonists a chance to develop, to breathe, and so they are longer. And it struck me in reading it that this is a book about documentary forms, and I'm just curious about the choice of the long chapter, 70-80 page chapters, and how the sort of attention to documentary forms maybe influence the way in which you chose to document this yourself.
Yeah. So the chapters they're longer than normal. I I felt really committed to telling a full story about the emergence and endurance, and in some cases, kind of waning of certain kinds of documentary forms or data producing forms or data expressions. And by that, I mean, there's this sense we often get in books or when we're thinking about certain kinds of material or aesthetic productions that they just kind of come to us, right? Like somebody like Sutton Griggs just kind of produced this novel in a vacuum, right? Of course, we have historical contextualization and cultural context, right? But I really wanted to try to capture is not the right word because the book is all about like against capture, right? But I really wanted to tell a story that was attentive to kind of the curves and highs and lows and kind of all of the different parts of the process of experimentation that's so central to how I'm thinking about the ways in which these African-American cultural producers and intellectuals took up these data forms that had such a negative relationship to the production of information about Black life. So that's all to say that I really wanted to like set the stage and give a genealogy and a historical contextualization and show who people were talking to and what they were reading and why they thought something like the social survey would have perhaps been a mode that might be able to give a different kind of information. So it's also really leaning into all of kind of the speculative, and I don't mean kind of the imaginative, but all of kind of the hesitancy, right? Like when we think of Du Bois and sociology, hesitant, right? But kind of the hesitancy that was always underpinning the decision to invest and deploy and be in conversation with these kinds of forms. On the chapter on photography, I mean, it was also just such an understudied archive, the same with Hurston. So it felt really important to tease out all of the corners of the story that I was trying to tell. And also, like one of the things that I love about this time period that's also really hard is that it's so messy. There was so much going on. It's so, chaotic. And I wanted to be able to convey that in a way that didn't flatten it, that didn't kind of make the period seem easy to engage with, that really gave some texture to the difficulty of the 1880s to the 1930s.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that hesitancy, particularly in the first chapter. I think I was really struck. It's a well illustrated book, but that first chapter has no illustrations, and really readers are not going to encounter data of the kind that maybe they think they're going to get in a book like this. And this is a book that is looking at those aesthetic offsprings that occur in the era of racial data, of a kind of new regime of racial data. But you're very hesitant to reproduce that data in kind of similarly, in ways that recall the people that you're looking at. So could you just talk a little bit about, trying to write about the phenomenon without, sort of putting into the background
I'm curious to hear, like, if you wanted to see the images. Like,
well, I thought, I might see, like a table from a social survey or something like that. But I think you resist. I think it seems deliberate that you don't do that.
No, I made the decision. There was an iteration where there were images of charts and graphs and things like that in the first chapter on the social survey. I think one of the things that I found that I was doing as I was writing it is that I ended up kind of trying to narrate or give an account of what was happening in the charts, right? Which is to say that if I was just, there is an exercise in printing the images and then, having the text do something else, right? But I worried that there is a way that just printing the images without kind of any close reading or contextualization would have furthered this kind of abstracting process or practice that I was arguing against in the book, or that I was arguing these writers were trying to loosen up or free up, right? One of the things that the social survey tried to do, I argue, is kind of breathe life into the static numbers and charts, tried different expression. So I didn't want to do that. And then it also, I began describing the numbers, right? Like, this is what's happening in column 1. This is how they got to the figures. This is why it's incorrect, and kind of giving a justification of why these are wrong. And that wasn't what I wanted to do either. And, the other thing is, ultimately, so the chapter begins with Du Bois and it ends with a Lane Locke and survey graphic, and which is kind of a, I would argue it's not coincidental that he turns to survey graphic, or deploys survey graphic, to make this account for a new generation of Black aesthetic expression in psychology. And there's no charts in that at all. And many of the social surveys that I looked at weren't able to figure out how to use the statistics or use photography in the way that actually was doing what I think they were trying to do.
Yeah.
So that was part of that decision.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about chapter 2, and which is illustrated by this extraordinary suite insert within the book of color photographs. I have some of them. They're in the public domain at the Library of Congress. So I'm going to share my screen. Whoops. So yeah, I mean, tell us a little bit about this. So chapter 2 follows Lavinia Baker and her 5 surviving children. She was the spouse of Fraser Baker, who was the postmaster in Lake City, South Carolina, and whose home, which doubled as the post office, was burned in a lynching, and he was shot to death trying to escape, as was his infant daughter Julia. And the second chapter follows the sort of afterlife of this event, looking particularly at the family. And so I can walk us through the photos, but why don't you tell us a little bit about why you wanted these photos and all of these photos? So it's 7 different photos.
Yeah. Thank you. That's a really good summary. Mine would have been much longer. So I'll just say really quickly what I was talking about Sutton Griggs before. So I first encountered the story of this family in the final third of Sutton Griggs's novel. They make a fictionalization of this event makes an appearance. And so I'd always kind of been interested in this story, and interested in what at the time when I started writing, I thought was just 1 or 2 photographs. And since then, the Library of Congress has found all of these. And so one of the things that I'm really trying to do in the second chapter is ask this question, or use this family's archive, and it's part of a much larger performance archive, as a jumping off point, or as the archive that raises the question, how do you produce data about racial violence when the subjects are still living, right? When we, always think of the data of lynching or the data of anti-Black violence as being a data of a death toll, when this is actually a data of survival, and not just living, but survival, which has a different kind of ontological and temporal orientation. And so these photographs were commissioned as part of the Baker exhibition. It was the brainchild of a white Northern anti-lynching activist, Lillian Jewett, and she brought the family from South Carolina to Providence and then Boston, and had them as a centerpiece of this exhibition, where they sat on stage and ultimately showed their wounds from the lynching. And in the midst of this, orchestrating this affair, which also included a film and musical guests and all the things, she had them pose for this series of portraits. So there was something immediately that interesting and captivating here that I wanted to think through, which is the idea that a lynching photograph and a family photograph are not actually incompatible kind of genres, right? And so this reads initially as a family photograph if you didn't see the caption, right? And then I also became particularly attuned to Rosa Baker, who's the eldest daughter. She's wearing the striped shirt and sitting down. And I was giving a talk on this early on, and somebody pointed out, her countenance, her expression, and how has a different kind of look, what I call in the book a smirk or a smile. And so, as I'm telling this recounting this story in the second chapter as a way to think through kind of the difficulty or the problems or the incompatibility or the dissonance between Black living and a data producing technology like photography, how kind of the efforts of this reformer to try to make those two things sync up always kind of fell short or produced these odd performance experiences. I wanted to both figure out a way to responsibly talk about these photographic portraits and also think of them as an archive of gesture, really, and perhaps thinking about the gestural life of the photographs as a way to think about a reading practice and a visual praxis that might allow us to breathe some life or animate what is otherwise a still photographic record. So in the middle section of the chapter where I've reprinted the plates, I invite us to read them serially. And reading them seriously kind of track the way that Rosa Baker's smile moves and shifts, and is both a record of kind of a rhythm of Black life and living, but also a different kind of visual logic that I call in the book looking out, which is not about simply reversing the gaze or producing a counter archive of Black middle class life or Black domesticity, but about kind of signaling a way of viewing photography as what someone like Ariel Azoué might call like a threshold catastrophe event. And so it became important for me to put them in the middle of the book as kind of a demonstration of that practice.
Yeah, that's wonderful. We don't have, unfortunately, some of the footage that you talk about in chapter 3, Zora Neale Hurston's films, but would you read a little bit from chapter 3, and then we can talk a little bit about.
Yeah. So chapter 3 is looking at Zora Neale Hurston and the films she recorded between 1927 and the 1930s. And in this chapter, I'm thinking about the technical and technological missteps that occurred as she was trying to film, and think about those as a productive kind of interface between Black life and a visual technology like film that's always supposed to be indexical and give us information. So I say time and time again, Hurston's films reveal a constant struggle to reconcile the filmic medium with its subject, Black folk life. Recast as a comment on the interface of Blackness and filmic technology, rather than an exercise in ethnographic documentary style, Hurston's films illuminate a social terrain that exceeds extant epistemological frameworks of cinematic representation. A cursory glance at the films begins to make this point. The 24 minutes of footage recorded between 1927 and 1930 are riddled with technical imperfections and inconsistencies. The film is frequently overexposed or underexposed. The lens is often obstructed and subjects regularly come in and out of focus. The film historian Elaine Charnob describes this as Hurston's method of pushing the medium to its limit, so that the film itself is as much a subject of the recording as Black life is. Extending Charnob's insightful observation, this chapter spotlights the variable technical quality in Hurston's films in order to become attuned to an understudied aspect of her aesthetic practice, one that I term overexposure. My use of the word overexposure draws directly on the technical sense of the term. Within the realm of film production, overexposure means exposing the film to too much light, which creates an effect that can be either minor, resulting in washed out images, or extreme, producing blinding brightness. At the same time, overexposure registers the limit of film's representational capacity, the threshold at which visibility collapses into invisibility and light doubles back on its promise of elucidation and transparency. In what follows, I extend this definition and deploy overexposure to name instances of excess, light, motion, bodies that disrupt film's basic conditions, synchronization, narrative coherence, embodied movement, and interrupt spectatorial expectations. Through encounters with overexposure, filmic experience is transformed from one of detached immersion to a persistently shifting relationship between viewer and the subject, so that overexposure's formal and visual effects undercut the widely held assumption that cinema can organize an otherwise unruly and chaotic social world.
I'm so glad you chose that passage. That was one of my favorite moments in the book, because it's a moment where, you know, something that could be discounted and read out of an analysis of film as merely a technical glitch or something like that is actually shown to be a kind of defining characteristic. And I think you so beautifully place it in the context of some of Hurston's writings. I think her first published writing is called Drenched in Light. Is that right? Yeah. So talk us through that. I mean, what was, how did you sort of come to this? And
so, you know, I had written about the Hurston's films early on, but I hadn't seen all of them, right? Like there were like little clips here and there that I had written about in passing. And then when I went to the Library of Congress, I don't know, however long ago now, and I sat there and watched them over and over and over again. You know, I was really struck by not just kind of the overexposure, which some scholars like Charnoff had noted, but really the ways in which she was, you know, working with this technology that she didn't have a handle on. Like she had never used a 16mm handheld camera. It was given to her by her patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason, to try to capture and get information, you know, about Black folk life that she, you know, Mason would keep for her own kind of collection. And so there was this way in which kind of what I noted to be both Hurston's kind of skepticism, to go back to that word, or ambivalence about the camera, also seemed to be at work on the subjects themselves, who didn't quite seem to be on board with the project of being captured, right? And also who's kind of the dynamism and what Hurston would call kind of the rhythm of their life actually just couldn't sync up with the technology itself. And Hurston would then go on to write about this much later when she tried to incorporate sound, and she was like, you know, the technology is too bulky. It can't move around. It can't sync up with what's actually happening. So there was always this disconnect between the technological conventions and modality, whether that be the film itself or the camera, and Black folk living, which is what Hurston was really invested in recording. And so I wanted to think about how we think about a term that made sense of that incompatibility as actually kind of a really generative opening point to, or theoretical framework, as I forwarded in the book. And overexposure, which is something that occurs on the film, became a useful way of thinking about it. I'll also say that kind of the overexposed nature of the films also led scholars to misread them, right? So there's these cards, white cards that the children hold up, that had traditionally reified the reading of the films being purely ethnographic, right? They say that these are kind of anthropometric devices that, you know, show the children's size and age so we can picture kind of early anthropological, you know, photographs or films. But when I saw them at the Library of Congress, it became clear that actually what was happening is that the children were holding up cue cards to start the film. So they said reel 1, reel 2, reel 3, not age, size, and height. But it had been obscured by the overexposed nature of the film. Like there was light searing down, nothing synced up. And so it also became a way for me to meditate upon, and it's one of the things I hope the book does, kind of how our own kind of preoccupations with what we think these texts should be doing and saying over determines our own scripting of what's happening in them. And so somebody like Hurston herself has in many ways just kind of been overexposed as an icon, that we don't actually see that the ambivalence or the asymmetries that are a crucial, I think, part of her aesthetic work in the films.
Sorry, I'm looking at the questions. I want to turn us to some of the questions from the audience. And I see one from my colleague Ken Warren, who asks, how do you situate the production of sociological data about Black Americans during this period within the broader effort to account statistically for all forms of American life generally?
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And it's such a good question, right? Because I think, one of the things that I try to account for in the book and that I was always thinking about is that this is the moment of like, statistical persons, right? Like, what Mark Seltzer famously like, kind of talks about as the turning inside out of the nation, making everybody's interior states visible for order and control and kind of the emergence of a biopolitical regime. So I think that's happening all the time. But what's particular that I try to draw out here about the ways that African Americans are being subject to and subjects of sociological data and data production is that the stakes and the questions were different and had a different kind of frenetic energy in the aftermath of emancipation. And one, the question really was Black freedom. So it was all of the other questions that were being asked of the modern subject, but kind of on steroids, right? And without any kind of solid answer. So it's the way that the question of free Black, or the problem of free Black life, I would say, intersects with that. And also, I was also thinking about the ways in which, something like the census, which was, all about making people statistically legible and valuable in all different kinds of ways, also was constantly butting up against its own limits of racial perception, right? And so the question of who is getting counted and as what also had a different kind of resonance to it. So I hope that gets at it.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, that raises a kind of maybe a final question for us to sit with tonight. And that's just that, the book is looking at a moment 100 years ago, but was written obviously during another moment of, say, increased data and quantification of aspects of life and the life of Black Americans. And I guess I wonder how you think about, if there are projects out there that you think about that are employing the kinds of strategies you see, the sort of grandchildren of the aesthetic offsprings of the 1920s or great grandchildren. And what lessons might you have for current empirical social scientists, if you were to be in conversation?
Yeah. So I think about this a lot. And tried to think about it a little bit in the coda. I mean, one of the things, I think there's a couple of projects right now that are trying to think about producing an animate body of racial data, which is essentially what I argue most of the figures in the book were trying to do, trying to animate data, trying to like make it more than a mere abstracted kind of death point, right? So like the Equal Justice Initiative has really worked tirelessly, to kind of animate lynching statistics, right? Through originally, I think it was 5 years ago, they just did a map that kind of had like data points that lit up, and now they're kind of embedding narrative and stories and kind of archival information. So trying to give some robust life to that body of data. I think where I kind of often I'm trying to choose my words, but to come meet some frustration, right? Is that I think often when we are talking about a data Black life, we're often always using death statistics, right? So which is what often happened in the 1890s, right? This was often, Frederick Hoffman using kind of death rates to forecast Black life. And so I think one of the lessons that lessons is not the right words, but I hope kind of one of the different archival legacies that I can uncover that might chart us towards a different kind of political future is kind of really asking what a data of life looks like, as opposed to, always counting the death toll as a way to think about what it means to live a valuable life. So, I mean, thinking about kind of the living in the case of the Bakers, or kind of the social rhythm in the case of the survey, or kind of Black folk culture is always evolving in the case of Hurston. So that's the lesson that I would hope we can traverse.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful way to end our discussion. I do want to encourage you, viewers at home, to visit the Seminary Co-op's website and use the discount Womack to obtain a copy of The Matter of Black Living, which is a wonderful book. Thank you so much, Autumn.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for being here and for reading, Eric. I really appreciate all the thoughtful questions.
Thanks.
Should I sign? Am I good?
Yes, thank you so much. That was really wonderful. I really appreciate it. And thank you for being our first, like, double header guest.
Oh, I was saying before, I like it. I like to just do them both. And like, I'm in the world of talking about the book. I didn't mind it at all.
Okay.
I prefer it this way.
I really appreciate it. Okay. Take care. Thank you again.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the quarter.
Congratulations. It's fun. It's fun to actually like hold it in my hand.
Yeah, it's nice to have it right in your hand. It's a really good job. It's a beautiful book.
Yeah. They did a great
I appreciate it.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Bye.